Good, good morning, everyone. So, we are starting today's session with the lecture of Professor Rajan Gurukal. So, it's in Intellectual History of India. So, his title is K. N. Panikkar's Contributions to Modern India's Intellectual History. I welcome everyone for this today's session. Thank you. Over to you, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah. Okay. Respected chair, and then dear friends and distinguished scholars. It's painful yet solemn responsibility for me as a student of K. N. Panikkar to speak after his sad demise. I seek to temper my grief by using on this bereaved occasion as an opportunity for academic reflection on his contributions to intellectual history. As you know, our intellectual history has been one of the areas of his special interest. Although his contributions to historiography largely belong to three domains such as colonial social history and agrarian movements, culture, ideology, and intellectual history, and public interventions on communalism and secularism. I confine my address to intellectual history to define how Kane conceived intellectual history of modern India. It's a critical, context-sensitive study of emergence of ideas in the wake of struggles over nationalism, culture, and identity. It's related to Kane's analysis of ideology, consciousness, and popular culture in the context of resistance during the colonial period. He helped deepen understanding of colonial society as a dynamic field of contradictions, conflict, negotiations, and transformation. Kane engages with Antonio Gramsci's notion of cultural hegemony, ideological struggle, secularism, and intellectual history. Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, as most of you know, implying cultural and ethical leadership, which explains how ruling class maintained power not only through repressive measures but through social consent strategically secured by embedding power relations within everyday culture through institutions such as education, religion, and media. Finally, making ruling class policies as part of dominant values, beliefs, and norms. This was a strategy of making social control natural and irresistible. For Gramsci, this dominance is never absolute, for it's continually contested through ideological struggle in civil society. Alternative worldviews challenged always prevailing hegemonies. Kane has written nothing on Gramsci's theory as such, or he never stated to have applied any of his concepts as such. However, they are predominantly there as underlying in Kane's studies dealing with agrarian movements, conflicts, culture, social consciousness, class awareness, and intellectual history. Although Kane has not acknowledged, he has cited Gramsci in his work on colonial culture and hegemony, a specific focus on such themes was obviously inspired by Gramsci's concept of ideology, culture, hegemony, secularism, intellectual duality, war of position, intellectual duality that orthodox individuals uh, with intellectual commitments and then organic intellectuals. And for that matter, like his contemporary social historians, Kane as well adapted theories, including those of Marx, Engels, and Lenin's, in order to ensure the precedence of empirical data, notwithstanding the problem of eclecticism. He was very careful about the problem of branding a historian as a Marxist or a Gramscian or anything like that. So a historian seriously engaging with interpretation, citing various theoreticians. Now, there would be contextual citations, but in lectures and personal discussions, I know Kane had been vocal about Gramsci. I remember him once characterizing in one of his methodology classes Benedetto Croce, Mussolini's advisor and a theoretician of historiography, as a traditional intellectual. In contrast, he postulated Gramsci as an organic intellectual who was in Mussolini's prison until shortly before his death. According to Kane, elite historians, even while handling their discipline quite rationally, were traditional intellectuals distinct for scholarship in traditional historiography, apparently dispassionate and neutral. On the contrary, historians noted for being socially conscious, critical, ethical, empathetic, and hence involved in activities of social transformation. According to him, are organic intellectuals in a war of position against elite historians. Kane used to emphasize his methodology class in his methodology classes how critical knowledge of history could be radical, revealing, influential, exasperating, and powerful. But the version available to the larger public is always the one that easily wins their consent through sentiments of flawed identity, false pride, and communal divisiveness. This is a statement influenced by Gramsci very clearly. I would argue that Kane could forcefully contest hegemony and actively involve in the formulation of secular public consciousness in the country in general and Kerala in particular. In fact, most of his publications since 1990s were meant to confront cultural hegemony and communalism. At moments when history writing itself came under political siege, Kane stood firm, not combatively, but intellectually, defending methodological rigor, scientific temper, and critical inquiry, and above all, primary sources first. Kane strongly argued history should not be allowed to be used as a weapon to manufacture identities. He consistently maintained that secularism did not mean denial of religion. For Kane, secularism was not a passive doctrine keeping religion and state apart, but an active, historically grounded principle essential for sustaining a democratic and plural society. He understood Indian secularism as distinct from its Western counterparts. It involved a scrupulous regulation by the democratic state for ensuring equal respect for all religions, while preventing any single religious tradition from dominating the state power. In his view, secularism was inseparable from the constitutional vision of India, where diversity was not to be tolerated reluctantly but embraced as a foundational value. Kane, drawing closer to the perception of Gramsci, viewed secularism as part of a broader struggle to create a rational, critical public sphere free from unquestioned authority. Kane thus helped shift the discipline from social history to intellectual history, with precedence over ideological criticism, and from elite intellectualism based on passive orthodoxy of colonial linkages to active organic intellectual in war of position against elite orthodoxy. Many historians in the field today bear the imprint of Kane's intellectual influence based on critical materialist, ideological struggle oriented, culture centered social history. The intellectual life of Kane was marked by a distinctive praxis oriented approach in which theory and practice were inseparably commingled. Drawing inspiration from thinkers such as Marx and Gramsci, he did not treat historiography as a purely academic enterprise, aloof, but as a critical intervention in contemporary social and ideological struggles. His writings on history, culture, ideology, power, and secularism, besides active engagement in public policy debates, particularly on education, vouch for it. Designing institutions, influencing curriculum, and questioning communal distortions of history, he persistently translated theories into concrete action. This fusion of critical inquiry with public responsibility exemplifies his praxis-centered approach. At a time when historical writing increasingly became a terrain of ideological contestation, he remained a steadfast defender of rigorous scholarship, rationality, and secular intellectual traditions. Now, what was the real historiographical task discernible in Kane's works? Now, when we think in terms of an intellectual historian, in fact, I have not come across any published works that engage with this question of application versus adaptation, or Gramsci versus historical materialism, or Gramsci versus empirical history, whatever it is. It's my own ambivalence in thinking that I share, but by making the case of application. I've always believed that although Kane never declared that he had preference of Gramsci when the question of ideology was discussed. As you all know, Marx viewed ideology as a distortion of truth, a version that deliberately distorts truth. But in Gramsci's view, as you all know, ideology has a different meaning altogether, I must say. And Kane, although nowhere declared that he would be taking Gramsci as the uh, hermeneutic basis or framework of interpretation, uh, and giving some kind of precedence of it over Marx's concept of ideology. Let us leave that debate apart. Kane knows how the indigenous elite, reformers, and colonial collaborators as traditional intellectuals legitimized the colonial dominance by transmitting Western culture. And there, he was focusing on the power of ideology. He identifies the emergence of organic intellectuals within anti colonial movements who sought to challenge this hegemony by articulating alternative ideological frameworks rooted in popular culture. Here also, ideology is conceived as part of uh, a very important weapon like thing in anti colonial struggle. Uh, Precisely because the British colonialists themselves were seeking various institutions such as education, culture, religion, and so on as very powerful ideological instruments for seeking a public consent or making people believe that they all belonged to their dominant culture. Now, that was quite clear, and therefore it was important for Kane to analyze ideology from the Gramscian point when the anti-colonial struggle was in question. Kane illustrates how colonial power, using indigenous elites, structured education, religion, and public culture to sustain its legitimacy, while popular movements sought to reorganize all these domains to invent an alternative culture of anti colonial consciousness. Gramsci formulated Marx's theory of revolution as war of possession, feasible in societies with complex civil institutions where a domination would not be overthrown through strategies of violent destruction alone. It must be preceded and accompanied by a prolonged transformation of culture and civil society through a war of possession. Kane's application of Gramsci aims at a fresh interpretation of the cultural and ideological dimensions of colonial rule, but with no claim to have done it exhaustively. It is done not without contradictions either. Now, here it's important to note that Gramsci never uh, developed his strategy as something that runs counter to Marx's understanding of revolution. He was developing this uh, as a necessary strategy in civil society on a long-term basis, but that was not as an alternative to revolution. Kane has creatively and very insightfully applied Gramscian categories for the first time to highlight the role of ideology and culture in colonial domination, though there existed a study of the same context, perhaps more with the conceptual details. I have Bhagwan Josh's Bhagwan Singh Josh's study that was published in 92, whereas Cain's study came only in 96. In Cain's framework, what I mean here is that in Bhagavan Jyoti's study, although we get a lot of conceptual details about Gramsci, you will not be able to make it stronger than what Cain has done heuristically and very clearly hermeneutically. In both terms, Cain's study is far superior because it's very very critical and creative. It's in that sense I'm saying Cain has creatively and insightfully applied Gramscian categories rather than dealing Gramscian concept in a few paragraphs or pages as a separate important concept to be highlighted. And then the historian goes on his own with the source material. But Cain's thing is taking his text always creatively and critically along, but keeping Gramscian insights as something embedded in his text. Cain's framework, the structural asymmetries and coercive foundations of colonial domination are accounted for the overdetermining presence of the colonial state, which rested on military power, legal authority, and economic control external to individual society. As you all know, Gramsci's context was altogether different. It was a national context itself, a national fascist ruling, and of course, very oppressively. But there's a lot of difference between a foreigner in the context of colonization. And in that case, oppression was much more intense. And then the strategy of seeking social consent was of a different nature. But in terms of a strategy, you find similarities, although the historical context is different, especially when you take this question of nationalist on the one side and a foreigner on the other. Cain recognizes that in the colonial context, the consent remained embedded in the uneven power structure, with coercion more direct and explicit. Being a foreign domination over a subject population, colonial coercion certainly was external, less mediated, and more basic than in fascist Italy, as Cain himself used to speak about it directly. However, if we ask the question, can Gramscian hegemonic framework adequately explain colonial power, or does it soften its violence in a very serious historiographical way? This was taken up by subaltern historians, and readily we can recall who dealt with the problem almost during the same period. Ranajit Guha, whose volume 1 was published in 1982. And there in one of the articles is historiographical considerations, something I don't remember the exact title. And then Partha Chatterjee, whose book was published in 1986. I know that Kane never accepted the subaltern historians to have been conceiving their studies outside the elite academic framework. I mean, he always believed that Ranjit Guha conceived subaltern situations within the elite academic framework. Anyway, that's an altogether different debate. Then coming to the specific context of Kerala, now when he took over as the Vice Chancellor of Kaladi University, Sanskrit University, a project was going on that was about the recording of the Vedic hymns. And Unni and K.G. Paulos have finished the first phase of it. And when Kane took over, it was with a lot of reluctance. Ken Neelakantan approached the new Vice Chancellor and talked about it and also expressed his desire to take it up. And Ken immediately took it up, saying that Vedic and Advaita thinking was certainly different from the Bhakti Bhagavata kind of movement. And he was interested more in conducting public discussions on Vedic content and so on, and making the text a public document. This was not expected at all by Neelakantan. And in a personal discussion with me and also part of a related seminar conducted at Kottayam, in which Keswan and myself were also participants. And Ken was very clear about his approach to the Vedic texts, Vedic hymns, and so on. I can see the approach of Romila Thapar also as part of this, and I knew that Romila and Ken used to discuss various matters and processes of the past that early historians dealt with. And I know that the entire Samaveda hymns were recorded during his period, and something like 10, 11 lectures were conducted by Neelakantan on public access to Veda, Rigveda and Samaveda. And it was during his period, the real recitation with the help of Mamanna, who was a scholar in Samaveda and who had been teaching the same intonation, stress, and so on, as provided for in the Pratisakya text to Asko Parpula, who used to come, in fact, for learning Samaveda from Mamanna Nampudiri. So on the one side, he was seeing, I mean, which I'm definitely sure that were not being understood or shared by these scholars, but his interest was intellectual history, and he was taking this as the role of a historian in war of position against orthodox kind of history, and using this as a weapon against the typical Mimamsaka kind of priestly culture, Brahmins with the priestly culture, who were focusing on Vedic rituals too much. But the texts were important, but important for Cain as part of intellectual history. That's particularly about Kerala, and I know that I have used up my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Gurukar. Now I request Professor J. Devika, Center for Development Studies, to give her lecture. So it's titled The Outside and Home, Political Masculinity and Political Domesticity in Early 20th Century Malayali Society. Please.
Yeah, I know it must be difficult to move from one topic to another one which is quite different from what was discussed without, a second's gap, I think. Maybe we should take a 5-minute break. I mean, I don't know if the organizers can do that. But in any case, yes, if we are not breaking, then let me start again. Yes, Dr. Panikkar was my teacher. He was my PhD examiner. He was also my advisor for my MA seminar paper. I was not personally close to him, but now when I think back, I think I am deeply, deeply grateful to my teachers in JNU who were not part of the Kerala academic networks for having given me encouragement. I mean, what was beautiful about those times, I think, is that teachers never praised you. Teachers encouraged you. Teachers told you truthfully what they felt about your prospects, your abilities. So my teachers, particularly Dr. Romila Thapar, Dr. Shirin Ratnagar, Professor Majid Siddiqui, and Dr. Panikkar, these 4 people in JNU encouraged me to stick on to academics when, at a time when I was actually interested in doing other kinds of writing. And this is particularly the case when I did my MA seminar paper with him. So my work was on Gandhi and Nehru and the ideas of civil society and the state in their work. And I remember, very diffidently approaching him, asking if I could actually also had a section on M.N. Roy, because the way M.N. Roy conceptualizes civil society seems to resonate so much with the Gandhian perspective, despite the fact that M.N. Roy really hated Gandhi, in every other way. So I remember how I still remember that spark in his eye. He was generally very, very, passive when he spoke, when he discussed things with us. Emotions rarely crossed his face. But he suddenly, I remember how his eyes lit up. And then he said, you should stick to academics. You might want to write other things, so you can do that if you like, but stick to academics, stick to research. Now I think back, the remarks of this kind, which were rare among our teachers, very rarely you would get such remarks, at least for people who maintained a certain distance from them otherwise, students who maintained a certain distance from them otherwise. I think it's those remarks that actually held up my confidence during the worst years of my life. When my confidence as an academic took a daily beating. If I survived that period, it's partly because these teachers held up my confidence back then. And though again, as I told you, I never tried to reinitiate contact with Dr. Panikkar when he was in Trivandrum. But I have almost, constantly thought of how his encouragement sustained me in my darkest times. And this paper that I'm presenting is my token of love and gratitude towards my teacher. So this paper actually came up, well, this is work in progress, so I also request you to dump the title. The title was quickly cooked up. It is not a proper title. I need to think through it well. It's work in progress, and it actually emerged out of the effort to think through the tremendous difficulties, the obstacles in the way of forming feminist publics in present-day Kerala, despite the existence of what one might call perfect objective conditions. So since the 1980s, we've had very large numbers of Malayali women entering modern education, securing skills in possibly all fields of economy and society. We have them actively engaging in the media. They are a large presence online. They also have considerable experience outside Kerala, networks outside Kerala. A lot of these young women working outside Kerala are also, pretty economically well off, and they could possibly sustain these publics. But again and again, despite our best efforts, we find that it's very difficult to sustain a feminist public. So why? And my thoughts about this kind of problem led me to look at research, look back into my own research on cosmopolitanism in 20th century Kerala, which is a project that I've been working on since the past 10 years or so, slowly working around the different kinds of cosmopolitanisms that were raised in 20th century Kerala. So the idea here was to put together two eminent figures of the time, Swadesh Abhimani K. Ramakrishna Pillai, widely revered as a founder figure, father of public-centered journalism in Malayalam, as we all know, perhaps, and B. Kalyani Amma, with who he actually entered into a partnership, in marriage. Now, I deliberately use the word partner because the duo actually regarded their marriage as a chosen project in the theoretically precise sense, as a chosen project reflexively lived. So one of the things that they agreed to at the beginning of their marriage was that the survivor would publish a record of their life together. And this was the famous book that she wrote in 1916 after Ramakrishna Pillai's demise, called Vyaravata Smaranagal. And I want to kind of reflect on the two books they wrote actually. He also wrote an account of his exile, or of his expulsion from Travancore, and it was called Ende Nadu Kadathal, which was written immediately after he was expelled from Travancore by the state. And this other book, Vyaravata Smaranagal, is an account of their marriage in general, and particularly of those difficult years after the expulsion. So I wanted to look at these books to find out if we can learn something about the kind of masculinity that, the political masculinity that Ramakrishna Pillai's work actually consecrated at the heart of public journalism in Kerala. Because if you read the book, you will see there is this repeated assertion of manliness, manhood, in using different words, different kinds of words. So there is the use of the word paurusham. Paurusham did not necessarily mean manhood at one point of time. At least in the 19th century, paurusham just could mean power. But by the early 20th century, you can see that that word increasingly became associated with a certain kind of masculinity. So that's used in that book many times. And I also wanted to see what kind of femininity ran parallel to this masculinity. So that's what I was thinking about, when I coined this term, political domesticity. I was trying to see if, again, as I told you, it's very tentative. I'm not making any assertions. So the context of all this is the late 19th and early 20th century Travancore. And by that time, Travancore had been under British rule for nearly a century. But by the 1870s, the Brownical sovereignty upon which the Travancore monarchy rested was hollowed out politically. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, it had already faced very serious kinds of challenges from oppressed caste assertions, including the well-known Chanar assertions, as well as the Vaikunta Swami cult and other such happenings. So in response, the Travancore monarchy began to change slowly, fostering a modernized welfarist part, so the state not immediately transform into a modern one, but there were aspects of the state that now began to take on a welfarist kind of face, a modernized face, and albeit with a number of limitations, and we all know about the limitations. For example, when the modern kacheris were formed, which promised justice to the population in general, they had to be located away from temples, because as a compromise to the elite Brahmanical elements of society which wanted to avoid caste pollution. The whole matter of public roads was a matter of severe confrontation because the Nayars who were in charge of law and order were constantly obstructing lower castes who passed through those roads. They were thrown out. So Madhav Rao, there was a cycle of Madhav Rao throwing out those Nayar men, the Nayar men going to the Raja, getting a pardon and returning to service, going on and on. So this is well documented in the works of scholars like Kuyman and Robin Jeffrey and others, so I'm not going to dwell on those. Now, we also know that around this time there is the embrace of modern market economy and the entry into the colonial world systems. So there are changes on the ground in terms of tenancy and many other aspects, regulation and a new. So what happens in this period is that the notions of kingship and subjecthood both change in interesting ways. And so, I want to just flag three different ways in which this happened. The three kinds of prajahood, perhaps. The first, of course, is the state itself tries to redefine itself. So Dharma Rajyam no longer means exclusively the preservation of the Brahmanical Janma Bhedam order. It means the land of charity, as Samuel Mattier. So it's a very huge shift if you think about it. So, and then the praja, in this frame, the praja is not just embedded in the Janma Bhedam order of graded inequality of caste, but also gets projected as the industrious subject, the wealth producer, implicated in modern social holds. This is something that historians of Kerala have already documented. Professor Raju, for example, has his important paper on the industrious subject of Travancore was a landmark, we all know. This industrious producer, the wealth producer, is implicated in modern social wholes, like the nation, modern community, etc. You can see the same figure being co-opted into different imaginations of modern social wholes at this time. The second kind of prajahood which came up at that time, which is actually complementary to the industrious producer, is that of the aesthetic prajahood. I wouldn't say aesthetic citizenship. I mean, aesthetic citizenship is an idea that has been discussed for the Victorian times through Matthew Arnold and the teaching of English and Matthew Arnold and others. We have, I think, Kerala version, the Malayali version of aesthetic citizenship beginning to take shape through the literary public, intersecting with higher education, with education, modern education. And this is, of course, led. So this is based on a form of belonging centered upon a shared regional aesthetic and linguistic sensibilities, shared sensibilities, largely constructed by Western educated local elite men. So you have the literary public coming up like this. So that's kind of a literary prajaship. Remember, it's still not citizenship, it's still prajaship. And then thirdly, you have a kind of oppositional, marginal but interested kind of prajahood. at this time, which is mostly from the oppressed communities, castes and communities. They are demanding the state's recognition and or resources to enter into the two kinds of belongings that I just mentioned, the industrious, the field of industry or the field of aesthetic belonging, either. And we have a number of instances in the late 19th century. You have the Irama Memorial, you have many other, the Ayyangali himself is an important figure in this kind of prajahood. And the voices of such prajas basically enter into negotiations with the modernizing state, with that modernizing aspect of the Travancore state, take advantage of it. Also, that includes also the British presence in Travancore and so on. So they basically are in negotiation with that kind of prajahood. So these are the three kinds of prajahood that were in circulation at a time when the pair I'm interested in, Ramakrishna Pillai and Kalyani Amma, are actually growing up. It's precisely this time when they are reaching adulthood. So Ramakrishna Pillai's, and what I think is really interesting, and that's how I would pinpoint Ramakrishna Pillai's contribution, is that his journalism radically alters this imagination of the monarchical political field by introducing a critical category of Podujanam, or the public. So this is very different from the praja. And yeah, it's different, but it's interesting. It doesn't really reject the prajahood altogether. So let me just give you a little, small, short account of his work. So this man entered higher education around the period that I mentioned, and he became obsessed immediately with journalism. His wife calls it Patra Branda, or translated it would be inspired madness for journalism. So he edited the Kerala Darpanam as a college student in the basically 1899, and moved over to Kerala Panjika. And you can see each shift is actually involves a difference with the publisher, who wants a milder, moderate tone of critique. He refuses that each time and moves on to another journal. And finally, he started his own publication, Keralan, which was a monthly in 1905, but was soon invited by Wakam Abdul Qadir Maulavi, well-known Muslim reformer at that time, to edit his journal, which was called Swadeshabhimani. And this was very successful. It went in very quickly, to becoming very, very successful in Travancore, and it employed very powerful critical language, which interpellated the readers into a new public of Ramakrishna Pillai's imagination, away from the submissive status of the subject, which is praja. The praja. So prajas began to see themselves very, very differently in this frame. So let me just give you a little more detail about this praja. So now this kind of journalistic vigilance on behalf of the public people, Podujanam is public people. So there's this great inequality, the gap of inequality that separates the states and the mass of the people seem to be bridged in a way. And to this end, he kind of draws on a mass of sources, and his journalism is actually really centrally cosmopolitan. So here I want to make this very important point, because I think this is very important. We need to, the imagination of the modern public in Kerala is not coming out of some indigenous, at least if you go by, if you treat Ramakrishna Pillai as a major figure, major contributor to both the discourse about the public as well as the public, both. In both senses, if you treat him as a major contributor to that, then we'll also have to admit that this imagination is not really limited to the horizons of even the Indian subcontinent. It is truly cosmopolitan. So he's talking about, he wrote about this turbulent national scene in India, but also about the struggles against corrupt authorities in Russia, China, Austria, Turkey, talking about regime change in these places, brings in the history of Mexico, Norway, Serbia. And he brings information of what is going on in all these different places, how people are universally fighting corrupt authorities everywhere in the world. So that's a kind of sense that he brings in his writing. And addressing the Podujanam, you know, so by the very act of addressing, bringing it into existence. So, so it's not surprising, therefore, you know, and why he was drawn to figures like Karl Marx and other socialist theorists and activists at that time. So the Podujanam then holds together, and I understand his idea of Podujanam as holding together an older sense of the public as the body politic, you know, the res publica, and the newer sense of it as a network of actors shaped through civic and political concerns, shared through the flow of communication as distinct layers. So these are two layers in his conception of Podujanam. So the former is imagined as a base on which the legitimacy of power rests. So people there are Podujanam. The Janam then is an organic force. So Podu and Janam are the two layers. The Jana definitely is imagined as an organic force, and the craze for journalism, that is the Patra Branda, that Kalyani Amma saw in her husband, was actually, however, the passionate embrace of this, creating the second layer, you know, the Podu layer of Janam. And so then he actually writes in one point that governments derive a conscience and self-awareness only from their fear of the people. So this is where I think he also maybe departs from figures like C.V. Raman Pillai. So C.V. Raman Pillai was obviously, you know, absolutely obsessed with the notion of the people and the people as the fount of desire, you know, of democracy. So underlying fount of the nation, the desiring heart of the nation, so on. But Ramakrishna Pillai is not doing just that. He's actually building a layer of Podu on the Janam. So this confers on the Podujanam a kind of historical solidity, which ironically enough rests on its capacity for change. So it's not some kind of timeless essence, a unchanging historical heart, you know, like it appears in C.V. Raman Pillai's work, for example. But this, the very solidity of Podujanam is because it is the condition of a Podu, and you have to build that Podu. The job of journalism is to build that Podu. So it's interesting. You will see this beautifully. I'm not going to actually talk about that here. It's in the paper, but because we don't have time. But it's interesting how if you look at the response that he gives to this is just before his banishment. There are several editorials in the Swadeshabhimani where he tries to argue that this kind of journalism is precisely patriotism. It's not against Travancore, it's for Travancore. It's about the Janam. It is building a Podu for the Janam. And rulers everywhere in the world, in different parts of the world, are responding to this. And there is no reason why only the monarchy of Travancore should feel so threatened by it. In fact, even the attack on corruption among royal servants, so it's about this layer of royal servants or the state, which is kind of mediating between the rulers on top and the people below. And it's almost like saying that if this layer of bureaucracy, state did not exist, the rulers would have changed and actually, turned around and bowed down to the final sovereign authority of the Janam. So it's literally like that. So this, and however, as we all know, there is this thing about there is the intensely political, intellectual endeavor of creating this public capable of representing the true voice of the people. It was also deeply gendered. So this also comes through powerfully in this work. So it was a manifest, as I told you, it repeatedly draws on this new idea of the Paurusham. So this is defined as the capacity to behave ethically, fiercely, fearlessly, and in opposition to power in the public, which became synonymous with manly courage in these times. So that's it. And if you read Ende Nadukadathal in this light, it is literally the performance of such a Paurusham, and that is committed to the defense of this imagined Podujanam, unified public, and that was almost disembodied, So if you read the book, I'm talking about the book itself. So you have a narration which is fearless, calm, free of resentment, convinced of the narrator's innocence, and confident in the power of rational thinking. And the 3 segments of the book are not of the same kind. So the book is in 3 segments, and they are linked by the force of Paurusham. So interestingly, the Pillay's first-person voice appears only in the middle part of the book, in which he offers a close account of his arrest and deportation in 1910. Instead, you have a collection of journalistic writings by Pillai critical of the Travancore administration, which is a response to various threats that the Swadeshabhimani received. That forms the opening segment. Also, he does not narrate the responses to the government's arbitrary act. So you have the first segment being these articles which are responses to the threats. The middle part is where he offers a first-person narration of what happened in the banishment. And then the third segment is a set of articles from local and national newspapers and journals which condemn his expulsion. So it's critical journalism across the country against the Travancore administration. So one would think that the first segment, Pillay's journalistic voice, replaces his first-person narratorial account. In the concluding segment, critical journalism across the country is used to amplify his defiant narratorial voice. So Pillay's journalistic and first-person voices seem to blend very totally, effortlessly. And the amplification is also, it's almost like a natural flow, as if there is no break between them. And what connects them is this idea of manly courage in facing power. So, and in fact, he even projects Paurusham on Amma, on Kalyani Amma, when he recounts her calm responses to the police interrogation that she was subjected to. And Pillay's manner of portraying police officers and other state officials who were involved in his arrest turns the tables on his tormentors. So they all seem to apparently belong, directly or indirectly, to the very public on behalf of which he struggled, because they are all sympathetic, they express their regret. And this is, of course, contrasted with the roughness with which the police search his home. So, coming face to face with manly courage seems to evoke, the public seems to come in life in the face of that. So, again, his account of meeting Kalyani Amma and their children at the Tirunelveli railway station after the deportation is very matter-of-fact and very unsentimental, rooted in the public, rational, non-emotional kind of self. So that's this book for you. So now it's also interesting how this new public dovetailed into the modern literary public, and Uday Kumar has very interesting observations about that in his own work on Ramakrishna Pillai, how literature and the so-called literature's ability to not represent, that's also important. Literature's claim that it does not represent reality or whatever happening, empirical unfoldings outside, becomes a powerful way in which Ramakrishna Pillai is able to actually now expand this. So the literary, this has very important implications for the so-called literary prajahood. Suddenly this whole field of literary prajahood seems to be radicalized and literally co-opted into the project of, the critical citizenship building. So, and Yet, Podujanam, I think, as a theoretical idea, it's a very novel one. It's interesting to see that it does not just reiterate Janam, as I just said. And it also does not, draw upon an individualist liberal understanding of the public, like, for example, Ayn Rand and others popularized in the 1960s and so on. So it actually, I would even say that it is this idea of Podujanam that led him to Marx, and not the other way around. It was not his readings of Marx that led him to, and this is where I think he differs very radically from the radicals in Kerala, I think of the 1980s and so on, who probably read European Marxists and others and came back to looking at their own societies differently. Here, I think Pillai starts from Podujanam and gets to Marx, not the other way around. So, of course, we know that there are these accusations of plagiarism and so on, which is Lala Hardayal's biography of Marx. So there are accusations that this was a translation of that work without acknowledgement. Yeah, I suppose that may be true, but maybe the times are different, and K. Damodaran says that it is not a mechanical adaptation of the same work. So moving on to B. Kalyani Amma, she too was a product of her time. She was modern educated, part of the literary public through her translation work, and of course also participated later in public journalism through her authorship of editorship of women's magazines, Megan's magazine Sharada, and also she was a writer and in her own standing. And the marriage was very similar to the possibilities sketched in early Malayalam novels, what is called the Andakarana Vivaham, which laid the base for an intellectual companionship. So Amma initially resisted this marriage. She did not, it was he who proposed. And she does say that she does not know finally why she got married to him. And she also kind of hints that there was family pressure. But Pillai, of course, was very open to her educational ambitions, and though he did not tolerate her dissent to his tactics, that is. I mean, she was equally critical of the state of Travancore, but she did not agree with his tactics. And he did not listen to her on that ground. This marriage actually grew more companionate after his banishment in 1910. So, punished for his insistent attacks against the Diwan P. Rajagopalachari. So Kalyani Amma had this deep interest in public, but she belonged to the first generation of modern educated Malayali women who located themselves in the active modern domestic sphere. And obviously, the contrast is with Ramakrishna Pillai's own sphere of work, which was identified with this new heroic political masculinity, the Paurusham. And these two paths of life were thought to be complementary. So that is the whole idea of the sexual complementarity promised by binary gender seemed to be actualized in this union. And that's probably why they thought that this should be lived as a reflexive project. They wanted to know where it took them, to live like that. So in many ways, this differs significantly from the idea of the Dambadi, the traditional Dambatyam, in the Brahmanical. So, in fact, there is this part of in Kalyani Amma's book. At their wedding, a number of people congratulated them and said they are like Rama and Sita. And Pillai apparently was alarmed, and he told his wife, please don't ask for some dough, we are going to be in exile perhaps, so don't ask for a dough and get me into trouble. So clearly they were joking about that prospect, and they did not fit that Dambatyam. But the fact that modern sexual complementarity they represented could well be translated into a more traditional Dambatyam terms, and I still can't figure out how that happened. And in Vyadavata Smaranagal, if you look at the preface that was written and also the reviews of that book, there's a constant comparison of her to Sita, Kalyani Amma to Sita, because she followed her husband into exile. Despite the fact that her fame as a modern woman is, if you think about it, is exactly the opposite. She did follow him into exile, but it was she who protected him. she who protected him while pursuing her own educational goals. She's the one who actually, attained her educational goals, and it is she who protected him with her income, and also by taking care of him during his illness. So she's not Sita. Sita had to be rescued by Rama. Here it's the other way around. The only thing that's common is the exile, and Sita following Rama. But universally, she is revered as the Sita, as the new Sita. So public domesticity is completely different, and what I call political domesticity or public domesticity is clearly different. You could construct a whole record of it in the 20th century, I think, if you think about it. For example, if you have read Dakshayani, Devyani Kujambu's Choiring Kannirum Nananya Vazhigal, or Rosie Thomas's memoir about CJ, you'll see that one could even actually see where it went in the 20th century, this whole ideal of, this whole possibility of public or political domesticity. So clearly this also requires the reproduction of the hierarchy between the public and political masculinity. So if Kalyani Amma clearly places him on the pedestal of great lives. In fact, that was a very common biographical mode at that time, great lives. So she's really writing a great life for him. But she also quietly underlines her role in his material and emotional, her own role in providing him with material and emotional support, quite like Rosie Thomas in her own, in her own memoir about CJ. So even as she blames, even as Kalyani Amma, she's doing this, even as she blames the instability of these neatly gendered division of space. So when she was pregnant for a third time and working in a school and running the house, Ramakrishna Pillai was severely ill and at home, but he decided to help her, by taking over some of the domestic responsibilities. She blames that for having worsened his situation. So that's happening, but there is in another way, she's also underlying her own contribution to providing him with a secure and happy home in the worst part of his life. So this kind of domesticity, as we know, is seriously challenged as an undesirable legacy of the 20th century. Now, I don't think anyone really celebrates it anymore in Kerala in the present. And there's a general pushback against patriarchy in Kerala since the 1980s. This is also something we are living right now. But what seems to be stubbornly in place are some of the truly violent aspects of the political masculinity that Ramakrishna Pillai's journalism, somehow solidified, I think. And there are many critics of his legacy now from an anti-caste perspective, for example. But I think this aspect, the kind of the violent aspects of his masculinity, of this kind of political masculinity, is not really discussed much. So we know that the Dalit critique is about his notion of Podujanam, is about how abstract it was and how it was blind to the actually lived graded hierarchy of caste at that time. So his criticism of all three forms of Prajahud that I mentioned earlier is both apolitical and insufficient, according to many critics like Cherai Ramadas and others. So his conception of the public is always and necessarily oppositional, and the primary contradiction is political in nature and between the state and the people. So the people have to be unified, and anyone who's questioning this kind of homogeneity of the people is trouble and anti, and pro-monarchical. So it's almost an illogical anger, that you can see that is underlying. It's not logical to say that if, it's not logical at all, if you think about it. So equally problematic also was his tactic of attacking public servants' sexual lives, claiming that the exposure of moral turpitude of the powerful was a duty of public journalism. So that, in fact, unfortunately, led to women getting caught in, unnamed, unheard women, caught in the middle and, scandalized beyond recognition. And these are women who have no voice. We don't know who they are. They have voice. They don't have voices. They cannot defend themselves. They are the counters in this game. So I'm trying to think through this. So I think that there is room in our 20th century history for this idea of the scandal public. The scandal public is not just a gossip group, but it basically it consists of malicious representations of public life shared tacitly and given, and like Uday Kumar points out, given the status of public knowledge, because it is. So the need of this was probably the extraordinarily difficulty of the task that he set for himself, that is the construction of an interstitial kind of public that was capable of cutting across tightly bound caste communities. So you can think about that being a necessity at that time in some ways, but it seemed to require the victimization of the women caught in the middle, rendered voiceless. So in Malayalam, this ended up, we can see the trajectory of this kind of public. So this is what is called Panikkar. I mean, it was common to refer to that as Panikkar. So against P.T. Chacko in the 1960s, and then the so-called ISRO spy case in the early 90s. And then by the end of the 1990s, feminists tried to intervene in this. So you have a whole bunch of cases. You have the ice cream parlor case, you have the Surya Nelli case, you have the many sex trafficking cases involving young women, young girls of the early 2000s. All of this, in all these cases, feminists tried to intervene in this, because most of them actually came up as scandal publics, and then the feminists were trying to somehow turn it and make them into feminist publics. But unfortunately, in all these cases, the victimized, voiceless person remained just that. And the scandal public was clearly stronger. The feminist interventions were not powerful enough. And then after 10 years later perhaps, Sarita Nair seemed to break that stereotype and upturn the scandal public, but it turns out we don't know about her, She's set up to be a feminist heroine. I know there were feminists at that time who said that she was the only true feminist in Kerala, I know that. But, well, we don't know. We don't know because her whole testimony seems to be ambiguous now. We don't know. So, but then, in fact, at that time, some feminists seem to think that the feminist public and the scandal public can be one and the same. It can never be one and the same. It can never be so. That is why Sarita Nair was given this, title of being the most important feminist in Kerala at that time. And now we have reached a situation where if an accused man is a rival or an opponent or a nuisance to power, then, a scandal public is immediately generated that moment. Now, of course, feminists have tried to get out of this trap. So, you have the Dilip case, or later, or earlier, the Franco-Molekal case. In both cases, the feminists really tried very hard to build publics outside, away from. And it was a little easier because neither of these accused people were political heavyweights. They were outside the frame of politics. So it was a little easier for them to do that. And but again, you saw how difficult it is. Even in this Rahul Mangutatil case, the impossibility of building a feminist public became almost evident. I mean, you have silent women at the middle of this. When a woman is rendered silent and is in the middle of this case, so you remember this situation became actually worse because of global governance feminism, not better. In the early years of this century, global governance feminism introduced, basically around the world, you had new legislation against sexual harassment and sexual violence. Now that just did not translate into support for feminist publics. And I think this is why, because in the rejection of public domesticity alone does not clear up the patriarchal legacy. In Kerala, we have, I think, decisively rejected, what is called public domesticity. So when we really feel outraged, when, for example, a political leader in North Kerala, Shyamala, is called her husband's wife, And she is a political leader in her own right. So we do feel outraged. I think cutting across political affiliations, etc., women in Kerala feel outraged by that. But, that is not enough, clearly not enough. Global governance feminism does not help, given laws meant to empower victims of sexual harassment do not produce the same outcomes everywhere that we can imagine, because these are global discourses. They have to come and contend with local conditions. So in a society in which women are used as counters through sexual allegations in past struggles, mere legislation will not suddenly allow such women to have a voice. They are likely to be pulled into the vortex of such male power games only too soon. And this is why I think, and we need to really think about this, because remember, scandal publics are part of our legacy of modernity. So it's not a coincidence that things happen this way, and they're deeply rooted. They are not just peripheral things. Whatever is happening is not a peripheral phenomenon. Remember, I started with the question, why is it so difficult to build feminist publics, though all the objective conditions seem to be present? It now turns out that there are also objective conditions that prevent possibilities being translated into more democratic and gender-just outcomes. So this is why I think feminists aspiring to build feminist publics that aim at justice for the aggrieved survivors need to remain non-partisan, So there should be no assumption that some political party building up a scandal public will be sympathetic to a feminist public at all. And perhaps in Kerala, and I'm obviously flagging the local regional context, so even in the regional context, it may look like automatic that, okay, the left is supposed to be progressive, so left plus feminism is equal to progressivism. Maybe that is a very superficial equation, and it needs to be evaluated against the history of Malayali modernity and the scandal publics that have been part of our legacy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Devika. That was really interesting. So let's have a short break for the tea. Yeah. No, it's really